If you are a regular listener to the Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to continue keep the show going and growing. Best wishes and keep enjoying the show.
Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and in each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research and their experiences. So put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show podcast. My guest for this episode is Dr. Alison Lamont, a lecturer in sociology and criminology at the University of Roehampton. Alison, thank you very much for joining me.
No problem. Hi.
Hi. I gave you a little bit of an intro, but do you want to tell us a little bit more about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, for sure. So as you said, I'm Alison Lamont. I have been working at the University of Roehampton this will be my 5th year, so that's feels like a landmark. But before that, I completed my PhD at the University of Duisburg-Essen, which is in the Ruhr area of Germany. I was taken over to Germany for my PhD because my MA, one of my MA teachers was going over there and told me about a funded opportunity to do PhD research. So I applied, and that's what led me overseas. So follow the money. Yeah, so that's my sort of background. Originally, I was studying Chinese studies rather than sociology, but through my PhD, which was awarded in sociology ultimately, I've ended up here. Wow.
How many different languages do you speak then, Alison? I'm intrigued.
Properly, one. So my degree program in Germany was in English, so it always feels like I've written something in German, but anybody who's familiar with the German PhD and indeed academic system generally is incredibly impressed, because it's a really rigorous and quite terrifying system in parts, but the English or the anglicized version of it is much more familiar and better. So I can order beer in German and so my conversational German, and then my undergraduate degree was in Chinese, so that was language and culture. So that was Mandarin, and it used to be quite good. It's definitely rusty now, because in my current research and in my current job I've got no call to use it. So I'm worried that my Chinese is vanishing, but there we go. I can still navigate a menu.
That's impressive. That's impressive. And what about sociology? Where did that start for you before your PhD and so
on? So my undergraduate degree, like I said, was Chinese studies. Looking back on it, so much of it was actually sociological. So there was obviously the language component and then the historical stuff, but there's things like modules that I took which were like Chinese state and society since 1979, like that was sociology. It's quite interesting the way disciplinary boundaries split you up, and you don't realize what you're doing, or you don't realize sort of aspects of what you're doing across different boundaries. So if you studied history, you probably studied something which looks like sociology if you put your sociology glasses on, right? And the same is true across area studies. So Chinese studies falls under area studies, but it could easily be cultural studies, it could be media studies, it could be sociology. So before I knew what sociology really was, I was kind of doing it. And then my PhD supervisor, is Flemming Christiansen, and he calls himself a political sociologist of China, which is a mouthful, and you will not find it on any ref grid. But that was quite useful for me to understand sort of what I was becoming, I guess, following in my supervisor's footsteps, of that kind of real interest of sort of historical understanding of where the state has come from and how it's kind of navigating its current desires, in so much as you can talk about the state as an actor, but then how society kind of is shaped by that, but also pushes against it and twists it and shapes around that. I think that kind of intersection's really interesting. So I kind of fell into sociology unknowingly. I do remember early on in my PhD somebody saying something about Max Weber and me just going, who's that? Because I had no formal training in sociology whatsoever. Needless to say, I ran off and read quite a lot about Max Weber after that conversation. But it's a very generous discipline, I think, sociology. Anybody can sort of come into it. If you're an economist, you've got economic sociology. If you're a historian, you know, you're already neck deep in it. If you're a criminologist, psychologist, whatever, there is space within sociology, which I love about it.
Yeah. And other than learning everything about the life and times of Max Weber, who else was your kind of big influences? Was there anyone else you were reading or particularly passionate about?
Yeah, so I fell into the Foucault trap, which is not really a trap, but I think everybody finds Foucault at some point in their career, and they either go, oh, because they've come across the ideas before they've read his stuff, potentially, or you find, I think it's usually Discipline and Punish, and you go, oh, it's a good title, and you read it and you go, oh, my brain is on fire. It's, you know, the first time you've come across these ideas, and they can be really invigorating, and then you come into the critiques of it and you see the shortcomings of it. But I had that kind of light bulb moment feeling with Foucault. And then Erving Goffman, theoretically, was another person who, I think reading Goffman really helped to slow me down and understand the importance of details. And I'm really kind of, because what I looked at in my doctoral work was very much sort of the study of everyday life, and that is the intersection of normality, which I pulled out of Foucault, and then actual practical experience, which I pulled out of Goffman. So that's a really, for me, those two are really energizing influences theoretically. But I was also looking at sort of disaster studies, so you got people like Kai Erikson, Alice Fothergill, and then this huge wealth of amazing stuff, which is bundled under Chinese studies, which if you're just in straightforward sociology, you'll probably never come across. But if you are interested in contemporary China, look up Yen Yunxiang, Susan Greenhale, Teresa Kwan, like Catherine Mason did a book called Infectious Change about the SARS epidemic in China, which is now incredibly relevant given the coronavirus pandemic. So there's loads and loads of stuff that kind of gets bundled away because it's about a different society, a different part of the world. But the sociological insights from those authors have helped me like hugely getting to grips with just broader sociological processes. So yeah, if you have any interest in any part of the world, dig out people who are writing about those specific areas sociologically, because you'll find gems and really powerful stuff.
I think you raised quite an interesting point, because I teach a lot of international students, many Chinese students as well, and they often state about how the textbooks are very westernized, very European, and there's all this great stuff going on worldwide, which we don't necessarily hear about at our end.
It's interesting, isn't it? So it's at Roehampton, we're going through this sort of attempted, but it's always an attempt, right, to decolonize the curriculum, that kind of engagement with more than just what we as white Westerners see of the world, and trying to engage with what other people are writing about their own contexts, from their own perspectives. And it can be really hard to tap into like who's good in that area, which journals should I be reading, which journals are going to give me more like political science stuff, and which journals are going to be telling me about the sociology of China. It can be really difficult to know if you don't have a grounding in an area outside the UK or America or whatever, and it can feel very, very daunting to get into it. So Chinese history is really particular, and it's shaped the experience of contemporary Chinese people in a very specific way, which you can't just guess at. So you do need to know a little bit to really get the wealth out of it. But any book about China written in English, there will be like the first third of any chapter almost you can sort of skim through as soon as you know the Chinese context, because every time if you're writing about China, you find yourself having to recite basically Chinese history from 1949 when the communists came into power, because that's the most contemporary stuff that you can get away with. You need to have that grounding, and so I completely understand why it's so difficult to tap into other national contexts. But if you can do it, and if somebody is willing to just sit and say, okay, so you're interested in this process, it's a really interesting example. If you look at Turkey, whatever, if you want to look at how religion and the state intersect together, go and just read a bit about that. And if they can point you towards some useful authors. So yeah, you need a bit of a guide, I think. But yeah, there's so much tucked away.
But I just think if you're interested in sociology and you're passionate about it, why just limit it to the Western world or the European world when there's all this amazing stuff out there?
Absolutely.
And thank you, Alison. That's going to be the end of part 1. In part 2, we'll talk more about your own research. Hi, welcome back to part 2 of the Sociology Show. I'm talking to Dr. Alison Lamont. Alison, I'd like to talk about your own research now, if you don't mind. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what it is that you research?
Yeah, so my research interests are a bit higgledy-piggledy. I think most people have this experience that you have your one major piece of research and then you're kind of the thing that you really put loads of energy into, and then you've got lots of little side shoots that you need to pinch out so that you can really focus on the main thing. I'm not very good at the pinching out, so I've got different threads, but the main thing that I have worked on and have published on is sort of the aftermath of natural disasters. So I've already said that my regional focus has been on China. My doctoral research was looking at an earthquake which happened in 2008, which killed in the region of 80,000 people in China. And that happened in a central province called Sichuan, which is, if people visit China, they will have gone to Sichuan to see pandas. That's what it's really known for.
Right, yeah.
And it's a beautiful part of the world. It's like domestically, Chengdu, which is the capital of the Sichuan province, has a reputation for being much more laid back, greener, a bit kind of more friendly than Beijing and sort of central political areas of China. So it's not exactly an out of the way place, but it has very remote areas. So when the earthquake hit, the rescue efforts were quite difficult to mobilize in some cases. So mountainous areas were affected. A lot of the kind of emergency resources are centered in the north. Sichuan is in the center, which is, China is huge, so it's quite a long way away. But it was a really interesting disaster in that it was one of the first moments, I think, in Chinese history where there was a real sense of China having opened up to the world. So when the communists came into power in China in 1949, there's been kind of a lot written about how it kind of closed off, turned in on itself, started to trying to develop a communist economy, a communist political system. There was a massive earthquake in 1976, the Tangshan earthquake, where nobody knows how many people died, and we'll never know how many people died because the state covered it up. The world knows about it because it was such a big earthquake that it registered on geographical instruments all over the world. But the state, in its first response, just stopped people from leaving the disaster area. So many more people will have died from aftershocks, refused international aid, refused to do anything effectively which would reveal how catastrophic that was. So that's the mid-70s. You get to 2008, the response was completely different. So in the intervening years, China abandoned high communism, as I think of it. So it was no longer trying to exclude any market economy. It has now got a state overseen market economy. And it's also opened up to global markets. So in 2008, when the earthquake hit, suddenly China was saying, yeah, okay, we need international help and we need the media to come and show us what's going on. We need political leaders on the ground in Sichuan immediately. And it was incredibly well coordinated. It was incredibly fast. It had problems, but many more lives were saved, I would imagine, in 2008 than 40 years previously. So it's an interesting event for that. I was actually looking at what happens to families where somebody had died. So if your partner had died, if your child had died, what support did you get from the state? How did you get back to normal? And that was sort of my guiding research interest. And it is sort of my guiding research interest in everything that I do, is what is this idea of normality, and why is it so hard to pin down? And what does it mean to get back to normal? So again, it's really pertinent to what's going on right now with the coronavirus, talking about the new normal and everything like this. But what was the old normal? So what does that mean?
And what, just for context, what's the classic kind of family structure and type in that part of China? Does it tend to be nuclear extended?
That's a really good question. So in that part of China, it would be broadly nuclear in the cities. So 2 parents, 1 child. Of course, China is famous for the one-child policy. In rural areas, the one-child policy is a complete misnomer. So there's been exceptions to the one-child idea for a long, long time, basically since its inception. So if you have a rural household registration, your family is a rural-based family, and your first child was a girl, you could have a second child. If you're an ethnic minority, you could have a second child. So there have always been exceptions, but broadly speaking, parents and a child. But that area of China is also a place where internal migrants will move away from those kind of more rural areas towards the cities. And then you end up with interesting structures where you have working age parents leaving children with their parents. So you get households with grandparents and children, and then the parents are off in the cities. You will also get extended households. You'll also get households where you've got 2 siblings and their families all living together in one household. But broadly speaking, it will be the nuclear household. It's interesting that you raised that question, actually, because I think one of the main points that I was pulling out in my research is the representation of this return to normal was filtered through the lens of family. So in media reporting and in the way people would talk about the aftermath of the disaster, people would talk about families getting back to normal rather than individual people with trauma. It's literally the family unit being fixed somehow, and it's becoming back to a nuclear shape.
And did it impact particular socioeconomic groups more than others? Was it a particularly poor area or middle class area?
So the area that the earthquake really affected was massive. So it really took in cities, villages, hamlets, the whole range. There's a really well-established relationship in the studies of disasters and so-called natural disasters, that the higher the sort of economic development of a region, when a disaster hits, if it is a wealthy area, you see massive losses in property, but very few deaths. If you're in a poor area, you have relatively little infrastructure damage because there's very relatively little infrastructure there in the first place, and then massive human deaths because the built environment has not been constructed in a way which will protect lives. So as part of the rebuilding efforts, China has really put a lot of energy into sort of earthquake proofing smaller, more local areas. Whether or not, though, the implementation of those standards has been up to scratch is the subject of somebody else's research than mine. But there's questions about policies and implementation. But yeah, very much you'll see a class differentiation. You'll also see an ethnicity differentiation. So one of the ethnic minorities in China is called the Qiang, and they are mountain-dwelling, very marginal regions that they live in. And there's been some attempt to kind of create tourism out of their ethnicity, and to try and document them as a distinct ethnic group. So the creation of museums, but generally a very poor and marginalised group. Most of those efforts were destroyed by the earthquake. So things like cultural heritage put into museums was lost in the earthquake. Many elderly Qiang people who are the sort of holders of language and traditions were killed in the earthquake. So yeah, ethnicity and class were both really significant in determining who is affected.
So when you started to put together your research, what was your kind of methodology? How are you gaining your information from, well, I guess, was it from family members that had survived?
Yeah, so originally I was looking at something slightly different, and then inevitably, when you start doing the research, you end up being pulled in a different direction. So I did some interviews, and because of the ethical issues that are inherent with a project like this, I was really cautious about who I was interviewing and the questions I was asking. So I was particularly interested in families who had lost a child. So I was doing my research about 4 years after the earthquake. So I knew that there was a government policy at that time to encourage parents who'd lost an only child to the earthquake to have another child, which to English ears, it sounds really uncomfortable because you are bereaved, you are mourning the loss of a child. How on earth could you think about going about having another one, right? But the particular context, the Chinese context, makes it make more sense. So there's a really limited social welfare system, and social welfare operates through family, in effect. So if you don't have a child, you're not only bereaved, but you're also looking at old age poverty, because you are going to be ending up using your pension to pay for example, medical expenses. The medical system is very expensive. You have no alternatives because you have no children to look after you. It exacerbates the problem. So in enabling parents to have another child, the state was trying to enact a form of social welfare. Lots of kind of associated issues with that. So in terms of what I was doing, because I knew that there was this policy and I knew that the risk of old age poverty is exacerbated by not having a child, I managed to get through gatekeepers in local kindergartens. So I was able to go into a kindergarten, sit at the entryway, and the staff knew me and I knew the staff, and they would, on my behalf, go and talk to parents who they thought would be interested in speaking to me about their experiences. The brilliant thing about a kindergarten is that the first year intake is about 4 years old, and I was doing this research about 4 years after the earthquake. So the parents who were there were either pregnant during the earthquake or shortly afterwards. And I was really lucky with that setup because the staff would be people that the parents knew. They could act as gatekeepers. So I sort of tried to use that as a way to step around some of the ethical issues. But it's also really just, how do you ask somebody, so what happened if your child died? It's not an easy question to approach, so I didn't approach it like that. So instead, my broad question, they were open-ended interviews and unstructured. So I just simply had the question of, what was your experience of the earthquake? And some people would very quickly shut down and just give you a kind of recital of what happened. Other people, almost everybody, would tell you where they were on the day of the earthquake and what they did during that moment. But other people were very frank. So I spoke to a grandmother who had lost her grandson, and she'd actually found her grandson in the rubble of the school. And she was very frank that she now had twin grandchildren who were born after the earthquake, and she wouldn't speak about their conception or anything like that, which is completely fair. And again, I didn't push to ask those things. But it sort of guided the interest of, so how do families recover a sense of normal when that's the story in your family life history? So when I started out, I was looking at it through family life cycles literature and trying to understand it through that kind of life course kind of approach, and then quickly realized that I'm not going to get what I want through interviews. It's very difficult to design a research project, particularly as a cultural outsider and a linguistic outsider. The method was really, really tricky in implementation. And I ended up looking at representations of family as a way to use what I'd received from interviews as a guiding force. So everybody talked about recovery from the earthquake through the lens of their family. So using that justified a media analysis of newspaper articles which looked at family recovery. And that was sort of how it hung together. So there are a lot of newspaper articles about specific families or generalized representations of families, and how, you know, here is Mrs. Zhang, she lost her child in the earthquake, it was tragic, and, you know, she wailed for 4 days and it was awful and everything was bad, and then she had a visit from a health worker who told her that she should have another child, and initially she was reluctant, but actually then she had another child and now she feels like she's back to normal. So those are the kind of narrative arcs of the newspaper articles that I was analysing, almost uniformly. Like that was the story that was presented in the media. So going back to my initial research question of how do people return to normal, it started to fit together that kind of the nuclear family was acting as a metonym for normal life. So if you could get your family structure back together, you're getting your everyday life back together, which is obviously a kind of false dichotomy, but if it's presented to you in that way, it not only reifies the normality of a nuclear family, but it also it tells you that things are back to normal. In the same way at the moment we're being told that going to work gets you to normal. We know it doesn't, but it's a narrative device which maps you on a course to recovery, whether or not you feel like you're recovering. It is the written record of returning normality.
And I was just going to ask you, there must have been people who didn't know, who'd lost a child and decide not to have another child.
Yeah, absolutely. I can find no statistical record of who attempted to have another child and couldn't, who wanted to but decided not to, or plain didn't want to. Like, there's no record of that. If you look, maybe you're familiar with the work of the artist Ai Weiwei. He did sunflower seeds and things in the Tate Modern, and he's a sort of known activist, dissenting artist from Beijing. And he did some really powerful pieces of work about parents who were bereaved by the earthquake, including some pieces of work in Germany where he had rucksacks, children's rucksacks, and he hung them in the sentence, she spent 7 years in this world, or something like that, to represent all the children who were lost in the earthquakes. So the reason I'm talking about Ai Weiwei and other kind of activist voices in this is because there was no representation of those parents who chose not to have another child. They don't exist in the media analysis that I completed, and it was a lot of media stories. And there's no record really of what happened to the earthquake orphans. So there was a big noise in the immediate aftermath about these children who'd been orphaned by the earthquake, partly because the Tangshan earthquake in the 70s that I mentioned earlier had orphaned huge amounts of children who were now in their 40s in a position to adopt, and all these people reaching out and saying, I know what this is like. If I can adopt a child, let me do it. And lots of people coming forward and saying, I will adopt a child. Adoption in China is quite difficult under domestic laws for various reasons. And mostly adoption happens within the extended family. But again, I can't find reliable statistics on what happened to children who lost their parents, what happened to the elderly who lost both their children and their grandchildren. So the lack of collection of data and the lack of publication, if that data has been published, is in itself a way of forming the nuclear family as the only response to the need for normality. I don't know if I've articulated that very clearly.
No, I was just wondering then if that's sort of the classic media, that they don't make the attractive stories. The attractive stories are the ones where people got back to quote unquote normal.
Yeah, absolutely. It is that sense of what do you want to read about at the end of however many months of awfulness? Do you want to read another awful story about how these people are now, worried about old age, or do you want to read about how the problem's fixed and you don't have to think about it anymore? So there's definitely an element of that. I think China's interesting because the media is no longer state-owned, but the state censorship is really sharp, and self-censorship amongst journalists is really tight. More so now, actually, than it was in 2008. But censorship is strong. So you're not going to get voices of people who are saying things like, the reason my child died was because they were in a state-owned school which collapsed. And if people are saying that, you'll hear it in the international media. And there were people in the international media, or speaking to the New York Times in particular, who were saying things like that. you don't find it in the domestic media.
Yeah. So I just wondered if there was also a contradiction between what the press was saying when you did your content analysis compared to what you were finding in your interviews.
Not particularly. So there's a couple of reasons why that might be the case. One, it was very much a self-selected thing. So the people who were talking to me were choosing to talk to me knowing that I was going to ask them about the earthquake. Two, I was very often understood as a reporter, and it's perceived as quite risky to speak to Western reporters, particularly about politically sensitive issues like the earthquake. So a Chinese friend of mine bent the ear of one of her friends trying to encourage him to talk to me, and he just didn't want to because he was, from a relatively poor background and a rural guy, had no real exposure to what universities might be like, what they were. So in his mind, researcher is reporter, is potential trouble down the line, not worth it. So anybody who was going to talk to me either had an axe to grind or was quite happy within themselves, knowing that what they were going to say was quite a politically safe thing to say, which is why interviews can be quite tricky in the Chinese context, particularly as a Western outsider, I think, because you are viewed as potentially trouble down the line.
And I was going to ask Alison if you could give us one example of someone that you interviewed. Is there a particular person that really stands out in your mind, or someone that you really remember?
Yeah, I think the grandmother who I mentioned earlier, so she was in her late 60s, tiny woman, and she did all the childcare for her grandchildren because her son and her daughter-in-law both worked. And then, so she had taken her grandson to school that morning and then dug through the rubble that afternoon after the earthquake. And she was interesting. So one of the questions I remember really distinctly asking her, so how did the government help, or what did the government do? And instead of answering the question, she talked to me about pensions. So one of the big things that the Chinese government has done in recent years is introduce a pension system in the countryside, which had not previously been the case. And for her, that was the biggest help that the government had provided. But simultaneously, the government had also done other things which would have been helpful in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake. And it may be that she misunderstood what I was trying to get to with the question, or I hadn't worded the question very well. But I think for me, that was really symbolic of the way in which the government penetrates everyday life at a much more local level. So things that I view as quite almost uncomfortable in terms of the state being present in everyday life in China. So you'll have street level committees who are effectively state workers, but it's like, some woman who lives at the end of your street who just knows what's going on, and the state can ask her what's going on. They give her a small wage and she tells them what's going on, and she'll look after local issues like keeping the litter off the streets or whatever. But that level of integration of the state at a local level means that it's almost invisible if you're in it. But if you're an outsider to it, it feels really kind of alien, like, wow, the state, it literally is everywhere here. But yeah, so when I talked about government things, I was getting big top level policy instead of local level kind of engagement with the state, which is what I was really looking for. So I remember that really distinctly, both because of the starkness of the story, but also as a kind of real learning moment of, okay, I definitely think about the state in a different way, or government in a different way.
And maybe this could be the final question for you, Alison. 12 years on since the earthquake, what state is the area in now?
A much better one. So it's really mixed because it hits such a big area. So in terms of regional economy, there's been lots of drivers to create local domestic tourism, also international tourism again because of pandas. There's some really interesting research done by Christian Soros, amongst other people, about how domestic policies which existed prior to the earthquake have really been pushed through. So centralising little scattered hamlets instead, many of which were destroyed by the earthquake, suddenly you could make them into small villages, and you could make small villages into small towns. So you're having this kind of urbanisation. So it's a bit more urban than it used to be. Things like whole cities have been moved. So Sichuan was at the epicenter of the disaster. It was a kind of regional city, has been moved by 14 miles because it was on a fault line. So they just rebuilt it 14 miles down the road. So whole new places have sprung up. But in many ways, the story is still similar. So regional China is still poorer than coastal China, which is where all the international investment has come in historically. China is currently trying to develop its domestic markets because international trade is obviously slowing down. So it's a site for those sorts of initiatives. But you would still recognise it. Like, I think between now and 12 years ago, I think I could still navigate reasonably well around the area.
Thank you, Alison. That's really, really interesting research. Thank you very much for giving up your time today. Could I ask you just to let the listeners know where they can find out more about your work?
Yeah, so I have a recent publication in Pacific Affairs, which the article is called The Death of a Child, which is looking at what happened to parents who lost a child in the earthquake. So it's specifically that. I should be writing a book on it, which is why I'm talking to you instead. Yeah, I have a Twitter account, so I tweet at @am_Lamont.
Thank you very much for your time today, Alison. Really, really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
If you are a regular listener to The Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to continue keep the show going and growing. Best wishes and keep enjoying the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email thesociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.